At £100,000 a day, will the private finance deal really prove to be good value for us?
Previous governments borrowed all the money they could and still wanted to do more, and so they borrowed off private companies because it doesn't count on the government's books.
First, the politics show can reveal the enormous cost of building the new Southmead Hospital under the controversial private finance initiative, and it's enough to make your eyes water. When you take into account interest, it's £100,000 a day and rising every year for 30 years. That's £4,000 an hour, and it doesn't even include maintenance. So, is it fair to lumber our children and grandchildren with those sort of costs? I'll be asking a Tory minister and a financial expert in a minute, but first, here's Charlotte Callan.
Like so many of our hospitals, these buildings in Frenchay were designed during the Second World War. They may have been state-of-the-art then, but now their roofs are crumbling and they're half falling down. The cost of rebuilding them was too high, so the NHS Trust decided to build an entire new hospital just down the road in Southmead. But the price tag of £430 million and no money available from the Treasury means they had to look for private finance. The foundations for PFI deals in the NHS were laid by John Major and built upon by Tony Blair when he was in government. Over 100 hospitals like this one in Southmead have now been developed. But now concerns from the Health Secretary, Andrew Lansley, who's warned 22 trusts, including the one building this hospital, will struggle to afford the payments. He lays the blame at the last government's door.
Not at all, because the government borrows money to invest in infrastructure, and we were faced with devastation of our hospitals, of our schools. We've just got to look in Bristol, all the schools that were rebuilt, and a Labour government desperate to bring forward capital expenditure and to build up, you know, both on public transport, schools and hospitals. So PFI was a mechanism to do that. Did it work perfectly in every circumstance? Well, I think we can see that some of them weren't well negotiated. But overall, I think whoever you speak to, there are pros and cons for PFI. But in the end, we got our schools and hospitals.
The building work here at Southmead Hospital should be finished by 2014. And unlike other building projects, the costs are fixed at £430 million. But just like when you take out a mortgage, you need to pay back interest. And over 30 years, that means North Bristol NHS Trust will pay back £1.7 billion. That's like buy one hospital, pay for four. They say that's a good deal. Other people don't agree.
What happened is previous governments borrowed all the money they could and still wanted to do more, and so they borrowed off private companies because it doesn't count on the government's books. So with PFI, it's like you max out on your own credit card and then you go to a high-interest lender on top.
The Trust declined our interview request, but say they can afford the repayments and that the PFI was their only option. But funding for the NHS in England has come under pressure as budgets are tightened, and in some cases there have been real term reductions in spending. The worry now is whether the debt is affordable in the long term.
I think we should be worried. I mean, the entire focus on the NHS is about value for money because we have to make £20 billion worth of savings. And I've been saying for a very long time, as they have in private eye, that it simply doesn't deliver value for money, and particularly in the current climate, when we're trying to actually take services out of hospital and deliver them more cheaply in primary care. It simply doesn't make sense to have expensive PFI deals. So I desperately hope their numbers stack up, but I fear they might not do.
In just a few years' time, this building site will be a state-of-the-art hospital with more single rooms than anywhere else in the country. But of course that comes with a hefty price tag, more than £100,000 per day. The NHS are committed to spending billions on hospitals that have been built now, but will be paying for long after many of us have retired.
Well, it's going to be a beautiful hospital, but is it worth it? With me to discuss this is Rebecca Pritchard, who's the director of the firm Grant Thornton here in Bristol. She works on big PFI bids, and the Conservative MP for Weston-super-Mare, John Penrose. Welcome to you both. Rebecca, first of all, £100,000 a day for the new super hospital. Is it worth it?
It sounds like a lot of money, but you have to remember it's an 800-bed hospital. And when you look at that cost and the cost of the PFI, it represents something less than 7% of the Trust's budget. So yes, it is a large number, but it's delivering a fantastically large service as well.
£100,000, that's about the cost of a GP every year, an annual salary for a GP. Every single day, £4,000 an hour for 30 years.
It is a big commitment, but that, unfortunately, is what it takes to finance and to run a hospital of that size.
Doesn't sound like good value.
I think it's hard to look at value purely on people are focusing on, and the fact is that at the time that this deal was done, the costs of finance for the private sector were really high. It was early 2010, and since the crash of Lehman Brothers, the costs of borrowing in the private sector have been quite a bit higher than they were in the past.
Well, John Penrose, I mean, we're going to get the benefit of this shiny new hospital. It will be great, I'm sure, but our children and indeed our grandchildren will be paying probably when it's clapped out at the end of its 30-year life.
Well, absolutely, and the fear is that, as you said, PFI is like a mortgage. Some mortgages are good value, some mortgages are bad. It may be that this one is good value, but around the country there are plenty of examples, I'm afraid, of PFI contracts which were really bad value, and you and I and all your viewers and their children will be paying for that for a very long time.
So can they be renegotiated, these poorer deals?
Yes, they can. I mean, it's difficult. They are binding contracts, so there's limited wriggle room, but we are engaged in doing precisely that because we can't sit by and pour money down the drain in that way.
Rebecca, they're not the companies who've lent this money aren't going to just say, all right, pay us less, are they?
It's not as simple as that. The finance arrangements are quite complex and they're difficult to unwind. I mean, in all cases, really, the projects are being financed by banks at a fixed rate, and it's very difficult to terminate those arrangements or unwind them without incurring a lot of costs. So I think it's probably about working as flexibly as you can with the contracts themselves and maybe with the NHS or the central government, picking up some of the burden.
These are fixed costs, aren't they? Whatever happens in the world, these are fixed costs which Southmead can't get out of.
That's right, not without a substantial penalty, but that's the nature of the PFI deals that were agreed.
But why did we go for them? Why not just say, well, look, we need this hospital, let's write a cheque?
At the time, the government just couldn't afford to invest the level of capital.
But we're paying anyway, though, aren't we? In fact, we're paying 4 times more.
We're paying over a period of 30 years, but it's not just about private finance. A substantial amount of risk is transferred through PFI, and you get private sector expertise in operating and maintaining the hospital. So that is a fixed cost to the public sector, it's true, but the cost will never be higher than is agreed at the very outset. And if the performance isn't up to scratch, then payments don't occur either. So,
I mean, is it time that the government actually said, look, if we can't pay for things in future, we shouldn't do them because it's not fair to lumber future generations with these costs?
Absolutely it is, and that's why we're trying to bring down the deficit as fast as we can.
So you'd say the government won't be doing any more PFIs?
Oh, no, we will reduce the number of PFIs very greatly, and we will only do PFIs in future if they represent very good value and as good value as you get through other mechanisms. The fear is that in the past, as we just heard, PFI deals were done basically because they didn't appear on the government's balance sheet. They were invisible to you and I as voters, and therefore it was a convenient way of brushing costs under the carpet. We're trying to make sure that's all visible from now on. It's all going to be in the government's numbers, and therefore there will be nowhere to hide. We'll only do it if it represents good value in future.
Of course, what people will say is that Labour had no choice but to embrace these PFIs because under the Conservatives' rule, hospitals weren't built, schools weren't built, walls weren't painted, and you just let public services go to rack and ruin, and therefore there had to be this huge investment.
Well, David, they managed to raise our national debt at the fastest rate since the end of the Second World War.
Because they were watering a forest that hadn't been watered for years.
They borrowed so much on the nation's credit card, and we are now faced with trying, as you and I as taxpayers, trying to pay that back. And then they didn't think that was enough, and they went out and borrowed even more under PFI. How much do they want?
I think people exaggerate just how significant the PFI costs are. I mean, for example, people Andrew Lansley and others made a huge hue and cry about the cost of PFI hospitals. But the PFI hospitals represent, I think, something less than 1% of the NHS budget. So, yes, it's a significant number, but of a very, very large number. And I think it's trying to really distract from the case that, there's a lot of pressure on health budgets. There are real cuts in real terms because of the services that are having to be delivered, and the whole basis on which hospitals get paid changed.
That's an awful lot of
results.
care, isn't it, for a building? We're spending, at the end of the day, it is a building rather than the staff which actually make the health service, isn't it?
Yes, but I mean, I'm sure you've been to Southmead and Frenchay, and you know what's there isn't sustainable. It had to be replaced. So I think it makes perfect sense, really, for a new facility to replace the Southmead and Frenchay hospitals. I think the thing now is to look forward, and you know, how can PFI be used in a smarter way?
Okay.
And it is probably going to be about looking at finance terms that aren't the 30 years, maybe looking at shorter.
But you'll be
tenors.
playing hardball when you're negotiating with the health authorities and so on to get a good deal.
We work equally with the public sector and the private sector, because as I said when we spoke earlier, both sides end up having expert advice to make sure that they know exactly what deal they're getting into. One of the issues with the PFIs, though, is that you talked about the £100,000 a day. The way that the Department of Health structured the deals, the charge that, as it starts out, is 100% subject to inflation every year.
Yes.
It's indexed by inflation. In other PFI projects, they say, well, actually, we don't want to have that much inflation, and agree a lower level. So the fact that inflation is running so high at the moment is putting pressure.
OK, we'll have to leave it there for the time being. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.